Morning, YouTube. My name is Phil Gallagher. I run ThrabenU University, a site for legacy, death, and taxes. And the quarterly legacy format challenge is coming up this weekend. Unfortunately, I won't be playing in it. Latin Academy happens to start on the same day at approximately the same time, so there's no way that I can wiggle through that one. So what I wanted to do was still produce some content for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down four of sort of like the new format staples that are impacting and changing the format. And I kind of want to show you some deck lists of like where these cards are performing well in and what they're doing. And then I'm also going to talk about how to fight these cards. If you are grinding Magic Online a lot, most of this will probably not be too surprising to you. But if you're only getting in a few matches a week, or you're still unsure about how some of these new cards are impacting the format, this is probably the video for you. So I'm going to be talking about four cards: Dreadhorde Arcanist, Wrenn 6, Narset Parter of Veils, and Karn, the Great Creator. So let's start with Dreadhorde Arcanist. This is one of the most impactful cards that we've seen to Legacy in years. There are some people who are really lukewarm on this card right now. I am not one of them. I am a big believer in the power of this card. For a 2-mana investment, you can potentially get one free spell every turn for the rest of the game, and that's absolutely huge. So the first place that I want to talk about this seeing play is in Blue-Red Delver. So this card, by default, only gets to go and flashback stuff with CMC 1 or less. So Spell Pierce doesn't count. Delver doesn't count. You have about 12 cantrips that you get to go and flashback, and about 6 removal spells. On paper, that doesn't really sound all that impressive, which is, I think, why some people are still lukewarm on this card. But in practice, this is Snapcaster Mage every turn. If you think about Snapcaster Mage, what does Snapcaster Mage target most of the time? Brainstorms, Swords of Plowshares, Lightning Bolts, CMC1 things. Against a fair deck, being able to bolt your guy, attack, bolt your other guy, this gets through and lives. Oh, your board's empty. Next turn, bolt, ponder into a Force of Will to stop your next thing from hitting the board, or ponder into another bolt so I can get 2 more of your creatures with this thing. This turns into a really impressive card advantage engine. So against any fair deck, Dreadhorde Arcanist is an absolutely terrifying must-answer-now threat. I am not exaggerating when I say this. If this card lives and gets 2 attacks, you've probably won the game, or lost the game, depending on which side of the battlefield that you're on. Now, in Blue-Red Delver, this card is very good against the fair stuff. It's a little scary to tap out for this against combo because it's not flashing back anything that's going to go and disrupt combo directly. It can keep feeding you cantrips. But compare the clock of this to the clock of, say, Delver or Young Pyromancer. This is an anemic clock, but an incredible card advantage thing. So when you think about this card, think of this as card advantage, not necessarily a threat. You know, this is really closer to something like a Bitter Blossom or a Sylvan Library in that it builds advantage over time rather than something that gets someone dead. So keep that in mind. Let's look at a similar deck list. This can also see play in Grixis Delver. The big advantage there, like if we just take a look at the same sort of like availability for what you have to flashback. Took a bump there. So you get 2 fewer cantrips, you get one fewer removal spell to flashback, but you gain the ability to go and flashback discard. And now, all of a sudden, against combo, this is the real deal. Thoughtseize turn 1, Arcanist turn 2, attack with Arcanist, Thoughtseize you again on turn 3, then have like Daze and Pierce up, or like Rebs and Surgicals and all sorts of good stuff. In Grixis Delver, this attacks from a slightly different angle, and it does start to become a disruptive threat. So if you're thinking about playing a Delver deck, you're going to need to decide. Do I think I need to be able to attack the hand at the cost of a much worse mana base? Or would I like the stability of being able to play 4 basic lands and a little bit more consistency with a few more cantrips. So there's your food for thought in terms of like the Arcanist deck lists. So Blue-Red Delver and Grixis Delver are probably the best homes for this, but there are other homes. This is occasionally seeing play in Grixis control decks, maybe in the slot of Gurmag Angler, or maybe like in addition to, numbers aren't quite settled there yet. It's seeing play in some mid-range decks like Jund, and also this deck. So this deck is called like Teamer Crash or Rug Cascade. The idea being that you suspend or get with Shardless Agents Crashing Footfalls or an Ancestral Visions. These have CMC 0 when they're in the graveyard, so you can flash them back with Dreadhorde Arcanist. So I want you to imagine this scenario. Crashing Footfalls comes off, I get 4 Rhinos. Attack with Arcanist, I get 4 more Rhinos. You see, that's a lot of Rhinos, and not a lot of decks can deal with 4 4/4s. That's like surprisingly hard to answer. This is currently a little more fringe, in that like Grixis Delver and Blue-Red Delver are probably, tier 1 or very close to it, and this is a little bit below that, but this strategy is certainly viable. I recently streamed with this, and it felt good. It still might need a little polishing, and there's some things that look weird, like the one of Mox Diamond. But just keep in mind that these cascade spells, these suspend spells become very scary with this card, and that's one of the major notable interactions about this thing. Other notable interactions. I'm just going to read this card to you. Whenever Dreadhorde Arcanist attacks, you may cast target instant or sorcery card with converted mana cost less than or equal to Dreadhorde Arcanist's power from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. Less than or equal to its power. So if you have a way to shrink this thing's power, all of a sudden you shut off those 1-drops from, like, really mattering at all. So for example, something like Plague Engineer can go and shrink this thing down to a 0/2, and all of a sudden, it's kind of worthless. So notable interactions here are that you can shrink its power to kind of shut it off, and that is very good with suspend cards. So, if you want to fight against this card, how do you beat it? Fighting this card on the removal axis alone may or may not be enough, to be completely frank, because of how quickly this thing spirals out of control. So some people might say, I'm just going to throw another removal spell or 2 into the sideboard, and that'll be fine. Maybe not. Because you can answer one with removal, but when the other one hits the board and you don't have the answer to it, again, it really spirals out of control quickly. So I recommend cards that will invalidate all of the copies of this simultaneously. So for example, a Chalice of Void on 1, pretty strong against the 23 1-drop deck here. And if you take a look at the sideboard real quick, this has like 2 answers to a Chalice once it's in play. That's rough. It's really rough. They can still try to like win through it by just like attacking with these cards, but a Chalice does severe damage to the decks that are really reliant on this, because it's a terrible, terrible threat on its own. All right. So similarly, Sanctum Prelate is really, really good, arguably even better than Chalice, because it's also going to stop you from getting like tokens with Young Pyromancer. So those are very strong options. Otherwise, I recommend a card like Rest in Peace, which I'm going to recommend again in another minute for fighting against Wrenn in 6. But this card is basically unplayable if you don't have a graveyard. Like, it is just a 1/3. And while that can like maybe occasionally wall a small threat, if you're paying 2 mana for a 1/3, your opponent is probably doing way cooler things. So a Rest in Peace that just like permanently shuts off the graveyard is pretty big game against these sorts of decks. And then the other thing that you can do to sort of slightly hedge against this card is to make sure that your removal spells actually kill it. And I know this sounds really stupid to say, but I don't think people are respecting this enough yet. So cards like Punishing Fire, Grim Lavamancer, and Dead Gone that do like 2 damage look a lot worse in the current format. Forked Bolt as well. Like, if I draw a removal spell, I want it to be able to answer this card, and I think that's very important. So be wary when constructing your sideboards. Another card I recommend to fight against this is Hydroblast or Blue Elemental Blast. I think both of those are very good right now. I will recommend them again in a minute to fight Wrenn 6. But like that has the flexibility of like countering the burn that goes to your face while answering this and answering Pyromancer, and also gives you some percentage points against some more fringe decks like Red Prison and Goblins that, you know, previously they're used to free rolling a lot of blue decks, and then all of a sudden you go, Hydroblast you, Snapcaster Hydroblast you, and it feels pretty bad. Also, if you are playing Dreadhorde Arcanist and you have Hydroblasts for the mirror, boy, that feels good. Hydroblast your Arcanist, attack, Hydroblast your Young Pyromancer. GG, well played. Okay, I know I've said one last like 6 times, but really one last. The other thing you can do to fight against this card is just play bigger creatures. So the Blue-Red Delver deck, for example, is really capping out at 3 mana as like the toughness point where the stuff is still answerable. So if you start playing threats like, say, Tarmogoyf, Gurmag Angler, Brimaz, that are just a little bit bigger than normal legacy threats, they have a big butt, you're going to have a much better chance of actually being able to live through a bolt and either stop this thing from attacking or make it attack and then like kill it in combat. All right, so end discussion of Arcanist. Let's move on to Wrenn 6. This card is insane. In case you haven't played with or against it, you should be testing against this card. It's very good in a number of archetypes. It's way better than it looks on paper as well. So its +1 is returning a land, its -1 is pinging for 1, and its -7 basically never happens, but it says you get an emblem with instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard have retrace. So the 2 big places this is seeing play right now, the Rug Delver and Loam, although it does see play in a number of other places. So it also sees play in like the Rug Snow or Rug Cascade deck. It's seen some play in Jund. It's seen some play in something that like resembles Check Pile. So let's talk about a couple of those. Starting with Loam. What does this card do in Loam? Well, you can play it on turn 1 here because of Mox Diamond, and that's notable for a couple of reasons. Number 1, it lets you answer some threats more quickly than normal. So for example, your opponent plays turn 1 Mother of Runes, turn 1 Delver of Secrets, or something like that. You just go Mox Diamond, land, Wrenn 6, ping it, and now you're on 2 mana sources, they're on 1 mana source, you've removed one of their creatures, and you have something that threatens to remove more on board still. So this gets huge tempo swings. Another thing that's really important about this card is that if it sits in play, it lets you make every land drop for the rest of the game. Let's consider this with Mox Diamond for a second. You get to keep 2 land Mox Diamond openers and have them be absolutely insane instead of questionable. So you get to go land, Mox Diamond, discard a land, Wrenn 6, plus get my land back so I can make a land drop next turn. And in mana-hungry decks that have a lot to do with their mana, like Loam and other like green-red mid-range decks, I can't overstate how important and powerful that ability alone is. Another thing that it allows you to do is recur Wasteland or other utility lands. So imagine you're playing against a Delver deck, let's say Grixis Delver that doesn't have any basics. Turn 1 Wrenn resolves, you play a land, you play your Delver, pass. You know, Wasteland you, kill your Delver, the next turn is get back Wasteland, get rid of whatever land you played, and so you just kind of get your opponent in this like Wasteland lock as early as turn 1 or 2, which is absolutely terrifying from the other side of the battlefield. And you can not just recur Wasteland, but other utility lands. Cabal Pit, kill your small creatures forever. Oh, you wasted my important land? I'll get back my Grove, my Caracas, my Maze. And it gets really silly with like the Horizon Canopy type lands or the cycling lands like Tranquil Thicket and Barrenmoor, where every turn, Wren's Plus, once you have enough mana, can just turn into like pay 1 mana, draw a card. That's that's a pretty good Planeswalker ability. When this cost you 2 mana in the first place. I can't sing this card's praises enough. But let's not just like talk about it in these like slower mid-range decks. Let's take a look at Delver. Did I not upload Delver? I did not upload Rug Delver. Oop, wrong window. Sorry. 2-second delay here. We'll just pull this one up on Twitter so it's faster. So this is GSY's Rug Delver deck list. I think they went on a like 24-1 run with the deck. And Wrenn 6 just allows you to do some really, really stupid things in a Rug shell. So one of the big problems with Rug Delver is once your opponent sticks something, you tend to die to it. Like, Rug's really good at stopping things from hitting play, but once something slips through, like, life can become really hard. So Wrenn 6 stops that on 2 different angles. Number one, it lets you remove the smaller threats. So, for example, some things like Mother of Runes and Thalia that might have been a little bit annoying before, or maybe a young Pyromancer that's, you know, threatening a bunch of tokens and blocking your big green threats, they become a lot less scary. And number 2, it also helps you, like, keep threats that are bigger than you from hitting the board in the first place. So with a package of Wastelands, Stifles, and Wrenn 6 to recur the Wastelands, you can do a lot of damage against stopping slower threats, like, say, Knight of the Reliquary, from ever hitting play in the first place. So Rug Delver is back in a very, very big way right now, and not just like, oh, Rug Delver's back! It's back this time! Everyone get out your mongoose again! Like it was last summer. It's like, no, this deck is like actually legitimately good right now. Basically solely because of Wrenn 6. Nothing else about this deck list really has changed. The only other new card that it's gotten is like Cindervines and the somewhat questionable Damping Sphere that I never understand why people play, but that's another discussion for another time. Alright, so just kind of recapping this card, it's removal and long-term card advantage that lets mana-hungry decks or decks that want to wasteland a lot just continue to do their game plan for an upfront investment of 2 mana that can happen on like turn 1 or turn 2. So this card is very powerful. You need to be aware of it. So what do you do if you want to fight against Wrenn 6? Well, this card only pings and kills small creatures, right? So if you can evaluate your threat base a little bit and play some things that are more resilient to just small removal, you're fine. So for example, if you're a Death and Taxes player, consider playing fewer 1 toughness flex slots and more greater toughness flex slots. Again, like Bahra was playing Brimaz in his flex slots, because it also dodges Lightning Bolt, you know, Dreadhorde Arcanist from the last discussion, seeing the trend here. Play things with big butts. It's a good idea right now in Legacy. You can also consider playing something that has more basics, or just making your mana base more able to fetch basics. So, like, for example, in Rug Delver, if you're playing a bunch of basic lands, the Wrenn 6 isn't actually all that scary, right? Like, if you can have 5 basics in play, Wrenn 6 plussing and just, like, returning their fetch lands every turn, while good value, is not the end of the world. So, for example, if you're a Miracles player, you should probably be playing Prismatic Vista so that you, have a better chance to fetch your islands and plains rather than having to go and get a Tundra. But that can get wastelanded. And then, sort of like the other angles you can attack from, like before, Rest in Peace. This card, quite bad if you don't have a graveyard, because it both invalidates the +1 and the -7 simultaneously. You can also choose to play a card like Pithing Needle to just like shut all the copies of this off. Pithing Needle, like, while good at shutting this off, is maybe less value than other Pithing Needles you might have, because a lot of decks are only playing a couple of copies of this, like 2-ish copies. So while shutting it off can be important, you don't get the I've invalidated 4 cards of your deck with 1 of my card sort of thing that you often do with other Pithing Needles. And again, I recommend Hydroblast, just as something else that can go and take it off the table. Against Loam specifically, that's slightly awkward because like Chalice of the Void may be on one, but against something like Rug Delver, Hydroblast, you know, it also stops the bolts. So as long as you're playing something that also wants to protect its creatures, you're probably getting enough value out of that. All right, let's move on to Narset, Parter of Veils. This is sort of an interesting card in that it's one of the planeswalkers with static abilities. So each opponent can't draw them more than one card each turn. And then the minus essentially is just a source of card advantage. So normally how Narset works is you play it, you minus it, you get a sweet card, another turn goes by, you minus it, you get another sweet card, and then this like one loyalty planeswalker just sits on the table with an ability that says your opponent can't draw more than one card each turn. So cantrips like Brainstorm, Ponder, Preordain, Important, all those sorts of things start to look way, way worse with a Narset in play. Narset is fine against non-blue decks, but it really shines in sort of like the blue mid-rangey or control mirrors, where it offers you both card advantage and the ability to shut off your opponent's cantrips. So while like the two cards that I've talked about so far have been main deck staples, Narset is a mixed main deck and sideboard card. So as a main deck card in something like Miracles, it goes and offers you sort of like another card advantage planeswalker that happens to hit the blue mirrors really hard. But as a sideboard card, some blue decks can bring this in as almost like a blue hate card. So imagine you're playing against, let's say some cantrip-based blue deck, let's say a combo deck like Sneak and Show. And you've gone and you've interacted with them, you've countered some spells, and then you slam a Narset. You have a Narset minus, I'm going to find a Force of Will with this, and now their cantrips have gotten much, much worse to the point of basically being unplayable. And this offers sort of a very similar function that Leovold has offered in previous metagames, where you have this card that hates on cantrips while also doing something else. Leovold's something else was that it was a threat. Narset's something else is that it feeds you more cards. So this is a powerful card, both as a main deck and sideboard option. To just show you another deck that uses this. So you'll notice that it's not in the main deck of this basically check pile deck. And just like side note, look at this Grixis control deck slotting in Wrenn in 6. That should be a statement of how powerful this card is. You know, we don't have Deathbright Shaman around anymore to make these like mana bases work. So the fact that like Wrenn in 6 can keep feeding you lands, very much valued by these slower blue decks. But if we look at the sideboard here, we see 2 copies of Narset that you can bring in for these blue mirrors, and it's also a fine card to bring in when some of your main deck stuff isn't all that good. Like, let's say you're playing against some deck that you don't really have sideboard cards for, but your removal isn't particularly good, then you get something that, like, you can, like, pull your Lightning Bolts and your Fatal Pushes and just, like, slot in a generically good card. And that has some degree of value. A couple notable interactions here. With the Monarch, so like say you're playing this in like a Stoneblade deck, if your opponent goes and becomes the Monarch, they only get to draw that 1 card a turn, right? And the Monarch triggers on their end step. So they get to draw a card per turn, and then not draw a card for the Monarch. You would think this wouldn't come up, because if they're becoming the Monarch, they could have killed Narset, but like, trust me, it comes up. As a D&T player playing Palace Jailer, and largely ignoring this card, trust me, it happens. Other notable interactions. If you have something that is a symmetrical draw card, like say Echo of Eons, the new draw 7, and you have Narset in play, and your opponent can't draw more than 1 card each turn, that becomes sort of a almost mind twist for your opponents. It's very, very powerful. Is that actually worth building around? Somewhat questionable, but people are certainly trying. All right, what do you want to do if you want to fight against Narset? if you are playing a blue deck, I recommend having creatures. I know this sounds dumb, but if you just let this sit here all game, the advantage that it accrues by like denying you the ability to cantrip is pretty big. So if you're playing something like Miracles, I recommend having a Vendilion Click or two in your 75 somewhere so that you get something else that can pressure Planeswalkers. Pressuring Planeswalkers is pretty important in the right now. Like Teferi, Jace, Narset, Karn, Wrenn and 6 are all seeing quite a bit of play. Although awkwardly, Click eats it to like a Wrenn and 6 minus, but maybe you can surprise your opponent and just get it dead or something. So I think Click's great against it. Red Elemental Blast has some good degree of utility here, while also answering other, prominent cards of the format, your Brainstorms, your Jaces, all the things of that nature. And again, Pithing Needle, fine card in the format right now. It's felt really good to me in Death and Taxes. Again, lots of Planeswalkers running around the format. Now let's move on to the last card that I want to go and talk about, and that's Karn, the Great Creator. So, this card has fallen off the grid a little bit, in my opinion, in the past week or so, but I still think it's very powerful and worth discussing. It's fallen off the grid a little bit because Recurring Wasteland tends to be really good against the decks where Karn is best. So, Karn is seeing a lot of play in decks like Bomberman and 12 Post. And if you look at this deck list, I have 3 basic lands and a little bit of artifact mana. So if you get an early Wrenn and 6 and you just start wastelanding us into oblivion, life gets hard, and it also becomes harder to utilize the wishboard options that you have. And the wasteland problem being a much bigger deal for 12 Post than here, but that's unsurprising. Okay, so Karn does a handful of things, and it has a lot of weird interactions that you should know about, and will probably get you if you haven't played against this card before. Like Narset, it has a static ability that it's basically no rod while it's in play. Activated abilities of artifacts your opponents control can't be activated. So I guess it's more accurate to say it's one-sided no rod. So you want to ideally assemble Karn plus Mycosynth Lattice. So when those two things are together, all permanents are artifacts. Activated abilities of artifacts your opponents control can't be activated. Your lands are artifacts. Therefore, you don't get to tap lands for mana anymore. You don't get to do anything except for attack with the creatures that you already have in play. So, life is bad. Note that this also makes your spells colorless. So, Force of Will... don't get to pitch blue cards to that anymore because there are no blue cards. Everything is colorless. Oh, there's one of those getcha moments as well. Okay, so where do I start here? So, the Mycosynth Lattice Karn lock is the ideal way that you win the game once a Karn is in play, but there's a lot of ways you can do it. You can just plus and beat your opponent to death with an artifact. Or a lot of times, you can just sit here, keep the Karn in play, and make your opponent focus on it, while the rest of your deck, say the Monastery Mentor, the Auriok Salvager's portion of this deck, or Karn Strux from the other Karn, just destroys your opponent. Because this card is incredibly threatening. Its ultimate threatens to end the game as soon as you can get to 6 mana, which is often the turn after you play Karn. For a reason that'll make very clear now. So, many times when you have Karn, you go and you wish for Lion's Eye Diamond. Then the next turn, you play your LED, you minus Karn again, crack LED. Oh, that's going to put you up to 6 or more mana. Now you cast the Lattice. So, while the LED in the sideboard might at first look like a head-scratcher, it's actually quite devastatingly good. At times, it's super situational, but it really has uses. The other thing fetching LED can do is it also enables your Ensnaring Bridge. So say you wish for Ensnaring Bridge, you play that out, and then you wish for LED, crack it, now you're hellbent, no one gets to attack the Karn. Probably ever. So the Karn's Wish ability has a whole lot of potential here. While it's not in this Bomberman deck list, other versions of this deck or similar decks play a liquid metal coating in the sideboard, which lets you turn any permanent into an artifact for a turn. Let's reread this plus ability, shall we? Until your next turn, up to one target non-creature artifact becomes an artifact creature with power and toughness equal to its converted mana cost. Liquid metal coating turns a land into an artifact, plus Karn on it. Its CMC is 0. It becomes a 0/0 creature and kills it. So liquid metal coating plus Karn turns into like a recurable wasteland effect. Similarly, if you just have any 0 CMC artifacts which are relevant, like let's say you're playing a Chalice of the Void on the other side of the table, like you've put a Chalice on 0 to stop all the baubles, you can go Karn plus on your Chalice, it's a 0/0, and dies. Ooh, this card does a surprising number of weird and interesting things. So just kind of recapping there, you can use Lattice to lock people out. You can use LED to enable the Lattice or an ensnaring bridge. You can use liquid metal coating to start blowing up lands or other 0 CMC permanents. And you can just beat your opponent to death using this card. All right, one more thing. The -2 here reads, you may choose an artifact card you own from outside the game or in exile, reveal it, and put it into your hand. So let's say that you play the Mycosynth Lattice, it gets countered. Over the course of 2 turns, you can get it back. Minus, get Tormod's Crypt. Tormod Crypt myself, send it to exile. Minus Karn again, get it back out of exile. So, just because you lose a critical piece of, like, say, your combo finish or your lock pieces, you can get them back using Karn. Alright, so how do we fight against this? Against the Karn itself, Pithing Needle is great. Many of the Karn decks really heavily rely on Karn to finish the game. And if you go turn 1 Needle, Karn Great Creator, they lose out on many of their good sideboard options. And for a deck like this, some of the hate cards end up staying in the sideboard rather than being ported in. So oftentimes you leave your opponent's best cards for the matchup stranded, in addition to just disabling one of their major win conditions. So cards like Phyrexian Revoker, Pithing Needle, and Sorcerous Spyglass are going to be very, very good against these sorts of decks. Otherwise, Wasteland, while not good once the Karn is actually on the table itself, really, is very good at stopping people from getting to the 4-mana Planeswalkers and then actually having enough mana to cast a Mycosynth Lattice afterwards. Cards like Cataclysm tend to be very good against these decks, where you have the ability to sweep out a bunch of artifacts or the Planeswalkers or the lands. I guess it's really an and in the case of Cataclysm specifically. But if you have something that can sweep a whole bunch of stuff on the board, it does a lot of damage to these decks. One of the big issues is that once the Lattice is in play, it becomes very hard to wiggle out of that lock. There's very few ways that you can do anything meaningful once a Lattice is in play. There are some things. So, for example, some of the artifact destruction cards can still get rid of it, like Crash, that you can sacrifice a mountain in order, to destroy an artifact. That sort of thing can still get this off the table. But outside of that, once this happens, you're reliant on your creatures to go and mop things up. Another notable, if you have a Karn, and your opponent has a Karn, and one of you plays Mycosynth Lattice, the game gets really awkward because no one can do anything. So one thing to keep track of in those sorts of situations is the number of cards in your library versus the number of cards in your opponent's library. Because in some of the Karn mirrors, it literally does come down to decking. Yeah. Similar things apply if your opponent has a Null Rod as well. So, Null Rod can also be a good sideboard card. Also, is a little expensive, 2-mana sideboard cards, sometimes a little questionable by like the efficiency ratios that, define Legacy. But it might be worth it against some of these Karn decks. So like, take this deck for example, like this Bomberman deck. If you go and you shut off all the activated abilities of artifacts, you're really stopping darn near everything that this deck can do. All right, so those are sort of the four, maybe not format defining, that's not quite the right way to put it, but of the new cards, these are the most impactful ones that are making sort of changes to Legacy at the moment. So when you are tuning your deck list for your weekend or deciding what to play, here's kind of like my closing thoughts. Number one, you need to be able to answer Dreadhorde Arcanist very, very consistently and very quickly if you are a fair deck. Blue-Red Delver is probably one of the most popular decks of the format right now, and I expect it to be one of the more played decks during the format challenge. So you need to have a way to answer that card, or you need to be able to ignore that card with what you're doing. So for example, if you're playing something like Tess, you might go off before this card really does anything that actively matters, and that's one way to attack it. The other way is to make sure that you can consistently answer it or in some other way invalidate it. Number two, if you can adjust your threat base to at least be above 1 toughness and preferably be above 3 toughness, that is great. So again, cards like Tarmogoyf in Rug Delver or cards like True Name Nemesis, also in Rug Delver, get to ignore a bunch of the removal of the format right now. Maybe that's a side reason why Rug Delver is looking quite good right now. And number three, make sure you have answers to Planeswalkers. That can be attacking them, that can be pithing needling them, that can be sort of attacking from an angle where like the current suite of Planeswalkers don't really like matter to you all that much. But there's a lot of walkers running around the format right now in all these like blue mid-rangey to control decks that are very, very popular right now. Now, there are other considerations to think about coming into the weekend, but many of the other cards that are impacting the format are impacting them at a sideboard level rather than like a main deck build around me level. So like, you will see things like Plague Engineer hitting play, and they can be very devastating if you're, say, on something like Goblins, Elves, Death and Taxes, or something like that. And it's something that is possibly main deckable as well, so some decks, like, say, the Stryfopile deck, can go and get another main deck answer to something like True Name Nemesis. But these, I think, are the big things to consider. I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up now. I wanted to spend about 10 minutes on each one of these cards, and I'm sitting at about 38 minutes, so that gives me a good indication that my pacing has gone okay. This is my first sort of like direct-to-YouTube MTG video, so let me know if you enjoyed it and you would like to see more things like this in addition to my streams. Thanks, folks, and good luck in the format challenge. I'm sad that I can't play, but I wish you all the best of luck.